Hello again, everybody. Welcome to Unit 12, the Post-Mongol World. Now, in this unit and the next unit, we're going to be dealing with the outcomes of 2 centuries of Mongol conquest and Mongol dominance, how they impact and how they shape all of the different civilizations that they come into contact with. This unit is going to deal specifically with Europe and with China. The next unit's going to deal with what we call the gunpowder empires, Russia, the Qing in China, the Ottomans, the Safavids in Persia, the Mughals in India, and on and on. Right? Now, bit of good news for this unit is at this point, we have now moved ourselves into period 4, the early modern era. And what that means is that content and curriculum wise, you guys are halfway done with this class. So, congratulations, you've made it this far. Only about, what is this, 12? Only 11 more units to go. So, let's get off into this. In terms of the recommended supplemental viewing, always go back to Crash Course. Number 19 is a really good one for you to watch. It talks about the trade relationship between the city of Venice and the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia in the Middle East and in the Muslim world. But more importantly, it kind of explains how in this post-Mongol world, Italian city-states play a leading role in reintegrating Europe back into the major trade networks. They facilitate African and Asian goods into European markets. They help diffuse Greek and Roman and Arab learning into the European consciousness. So there's a whole lot packed into that episode, so I would highly recommend watching it. Crash Course 21 deals with the Renaissance. It's a good episode to watch, but it's also, at least in my opinion, kind of a misleading episode to watch. Basically, in that one, John Green argues whether the Renaissance was actually a thing or not, or just kind of a figment of our imagination, which I completely disagree with him on, but it's a good perspective to take a look at. 22 deals with several of the important maritime explorers from this era, focuses on Columbus and Da Gama and Zheng He. So it's definitely worth a watch. The last link there is actually, it's a very short lecture from a professor who does AP Euro. Um, Now, obviously, most of you don't want to watch another lecture inside of a lecture, and I get that. But the video is only about 8 or 9 minutes long, and it honestly will be really, really helpful to you. Not so much in this unit, but going forward, because humanism, Renaissance humanism, is the basis for some very important scientific and philosophical advancements that are going to be coming out of Europe over the next like 6 or 7 chapters. And all of those things trace their roots back to humanism. So the better you understand humanism, the better you're going to be understanding Unit 18, Unit 19, Unit 20. Now, let's start all of this in China. China is essentially the cornerstone civilization of Asia. It's the oldest, it's the most influential. So let's give it its due and start the post Mongol world in China. Now, the post Mongol world in China begins with the removal of the Mongols from China. And several different factors play into that. Obviously, the Black Death plays a big role. It kills a large percentage of the population of China, which reduces the Mongols' ability to tax. There are also peasant revolts against the Mongols as the Mongols gradually take more and more Chinese land and devote it to pastoralism and less to agriculture, which means that the peasants have less to eat. And also, after the death of Kublai Khan, there is a string of much weaker leadership within Mongol China, which is known as the Yuan dynasty. Um, there's a lot of infighting. There's a lot of kind of Mongol civil war against each other. So yeah, the combination of all of these things leads to the Mongols being run out of China in 1368. And the Chinese reestablish themselves in their typical Chinese Middle Kingdom fashion, and this becomes known as the Ming Dynasty. Now, the Ming Dynasty has essentially one sole purpose, and that is to restore traditional China and to scrub themselves of any semblance of Mongol influence. So, if you want to restore traditional China, the first step in doing that, and we've talked about this cycle many times, is to bring back Confucius. So Confucian traditions and teachings are restored. Filial piety becomes the cultural norm again. The royal universities reopen. The civil service exam begins being administered again. Foot binding becomes culturally popular among the upper classes. All of those kind of Confucian-based traditional things. Patriarchy firmly reestablishes itself. The Ming also purposefully go and replant and resow and rebuild the canal infrastructure in China so that they can devote the land back to agriculture. Um, Another big move on their part is the exclusion of foreigners from government positions. This is a massive change because if you remember, the Mongols were known for dragging talented, skilled people from all over the empire and bringing them back to China in order to help facilitate the bureaucracy in China, which they themselves really had no skills in running. So by getting rid of all foreign control, this really kind of centralizes power in the hands of the emperor. Um, and under the Ming, with no more Mongols in the way and no more Black Death, you know, destroying trade routes, the economy and the population start to pretty quickly rebound. Um, the majority of this recovery happens under one particular emperor, Emperor Yongle. Yongle is kind of seen as the high point of the Ming Dynasty. He compiles what's known as the Encyclopedia or the Encyclopediae. This brings together all of the collected learning of what's seen as the traditional Chinese dynasties, mainly the Han, the Sung, and the Dong. Also, in order to get back to promoting China's greatness and their superiority, um, Yongle puts together the largest fleet that is ever seen in human history up until about the 19th century. And they sail this fleet into southern Asia and the Indian Ocean to promote their dominance. The purpose of the fleet is to collect tribute, it is to promote trade, but, and this is a big difference between China's maritime exploration and the European maritime exploration, their goal is not in any way to colonize or settle new lands. And we'll talk in a couple of slides about isolationism under the Ming, but you have to remember, if you remember nothing else about the Ming Dynasty in China, its goal was to eliminate foreign influence, okay? To drive foreign influence and, for a good part, foreign people out of China. So colonizing or settling new lands would really have kind of the unintended side effect of integrating more foreigners into China and into Chinese culture. And that's kind of the last thing that the Ming want, right? Now, this fleet that Emperor Yongle puts together, like I said, it is the largest fleet that has ever sailed in human history up until the 19th century. Um, It's made up of roughly about 300 vessels. There you have the tribute ships. These are essentially floating palaces with crews of over 3,000. Essentially, this is where Zhang He and his vice admirals would find themselves. The captains of these ships essentially had the full authority of the Chinese emperor with them at all times. So they could make political and economic decisions just simply, you know, because of the prestige of being the captain of one of these ships. There are troop ships, there are watering ships, food ships, there are even ritual ships where foreign leaders and foreign ambassadors are brought to perform the kowtow before Zhang He and before the other captains of this fleet. There are also transport ships, very, very luxurious transport ships, built out with gold and silk. These are used to transport foreign rulers and foreign ambassadors back to China so that they can meet the emperor and perform the kowtow in person. There's also tribute ships, which are used to collect foreign offerings, collect taxes. So, I mean, this is a massive, massive undertaking. And the reason why Yongle decides to dedicate so much time and resources to this is to reestablish China's prestige and reestablish the tribute system in South and East Asia. Under the Mongols, the Chinese they weren't completely mistreated. The Mongols were pretty tolerant rulers, but they actively discriminated against the Chinese. They actively denigrated Chinese culture, looking at it as weak and soft. And this is a massive blow to the collective psyche of China. Remember, this is a country, this is a nation, a people who literally see themselves as the center of the planet, okay, as the Middle Kingdom. And this 200-year period of domination by the Mongols puts into question whether China really is superior to their neighbors and to the other nations and the other people in Asia. So part of the decision to create this massive fleet was to reestablish that Chinese superiority of over top of their neighbors. Now, as you can probably guess, a fleet like this is enormously expensive, and the amount of money and the amount of time and the amount of resources and manpower that not only goes into building it but also into operating it is not especially popular with the wealthy landowning class in China, because they're the ones who are bearing most of the tax burden to pay for this. So what ends up happening is, after the death of the Yongle emperor, essentially the fleet is abandoned. Um, the 300 vessels are docked, they are anchored, and they are basically just left in port to rot away. And that's exactly what happens to them. And all of the resources and the manpower that had gone into Zhang He's expeditions are now turned north against the nomadic tribes that have always been China's long-standing enemy. And securing that border and extending the Great Wall becomes the main focus of the Ming Dynasty going forward.